Thank you ever so much for the invitation to speak here this evening. I've had a good couple of days working with the master's students and the journalism students, and it's great to see such a fantastic facility that you have here. You're very lucky to have such a great facility and some good people working here in coaching and in science, and it's nice to see that all in one space, and people helping each other in different sports and in different disciplines. I'm from the University of Brighton, and we have some good researchers. We look very good on environmental physiology, in nutrition, in endurance physiology, and it's good to have this partnership with yourselves. And of course, anyone's welcome to come to the University of Brighton and do some placement there or come and work with us, and people have done that so far. So I'm here with an Erasmus opportunity. So the Erasmus have funded the talk, and I appreciate that. And particularly I appreciate Patricia for organising everything. It's quite difficult just to get through the bureaucracy to get me here, but it's nice to be here and for me to be able to talk to you about the things that I do, but also for me to learn about the system here and how it operates, and potentially how it can make Great Britain athletes stronger as well. It's a good system you have here. But I'm not stealing anything, don't worry. So yeah, based on the south coast, right on the edge of the coast in Eastbourne is where I'm from. I at 17 years old, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I joined the Navy, and I played water polo in the Navy for about 10 weeks a year, and travelled around the world. And I left as a chief petty officer. I was in charge of a missile system that would take out the INSEP missile as it came into the ship, and it was called a Seawolf missile system. And I wasn't really into the idea of war, but I was interested in learning about sport and getting some qualifications, and I got those qualifications in engineering. And I didn't realise later on that I would need to use the engineering principles in sport, you know, whether that's analysing someone's performance or looking at how a piece of equipment works. These skills became quite useful for me. And I left after I did 9 years in the Navy, so I started my degree at 26 years old. Having been in the Navy for 9 years, I realised I could grow my hair, and I never got it cut for a few years afterwards. But I learned some quite good things, and I got some good travel. I then did sports science degree in Brighton, and then went on to do a PhD, and I finished my PhD in Australia at the University of Queensland, where I was able to look into something called the critical power concept. And Professor van der Waal is instrumental in this area, and obviously a lot of his work and the work from colleagues in France and across the world have enabled me to progress my career in this concept of critical power, critical velocity. And it's a very important concept because it's an area where you can exercise for a very long time, and it's about getting the threshold of training right. And I apply that to the work I do with my athletes and the work I do with myself. I'm a long-distance swimmer, so I want to be able to swim for a very long time. I do swims that are 8 hours long. I plan to swim the Channel on my own this year, 12 hours to swim the Channel maybe. I need to make sure I get the training right so I can work right on the edge of my ability. But when I finished my PhD, I went to work with the British cycling and worked as a physiologist with the Olympic team, the BMX team, the track team, the road team, and particularly the Paralympic team. And this is where most of my experience in elite sport has gathered, and I've done very well in coaching people in elite Paralympic sport. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with much Paralympic sport, but it's a good education to be aware of, and my work is to try and make people gold medalists and multiple gold medalists, and that's quite a hard job in training and coaching those people to make them perform so many times on repeated occasions. So it's trying to get the best out of the athlete. So it doesn't matter today if you're an expert in wrestling, or if you're an expert in basketball, if you're an expert in diving, some of the principles that I talk about today, hopefully something will be useful for you. So my PhD work looked at muscle metabolism and looked at the differences between high and low intensity exercise and steady intensity exercise. And ultimately, I wanted to know what was going on inside the muscle. And this was really useful research. We know inside the muscle we can find out what the muscle glycogen is like, what the muscle ATP is doing, what the phosphocreatine is doing, what the acidity of the muscle is like. And I wanted to see how it differed between high, low, and steady. So we do this kind of thing. And look away now if you don't like needles. So we anaesthetize the muscle, and in my study we're looking at before, after 15 minutes, and then after 30 minutes. And last evening, Professor van der Waal was telling me about how he did this technique, and I don't know if he'll tell you how the muscle went flying and landed on the floor. It's very, very, very interesting. So if you get a muscle biopsy, don't get one from this man. No, he's very good. But it's an interesting technique. It's a small bit of muscle, but it tells you so much about what's going on, and we use it to find out what's happening in protein. We use it to find out what's happening in our muscle acidity and how our muscle changes in response to an intervention, which may be nutrition, in response to training, to see if the training is working at the muscle level, and to see how we develop and make some interesting studies. So it's difficult to do these studies on elite athletes, and we don't need to do that on elite athletes necessarily. We can do it on other people in the labs that volunteer and find out a little bit more about what's going on. But things are changing in this. We can find out a lot more what's going on inside the muscle by looking in a magnet and find out the changes there. So we don't necessarily need to be so invasive, and we don't need to do it on all of our athletes. So that's one part of my research, looking at muscle metabolism and seeing what happens, and that's important for training. It's important to see how we can get the training correct. But I also mentioned before, you saw a picture of the heart, so let me just go back to that. I had a collapse in 2000 in Sydney, and I ended up in the hospital, and I collapsed, and I was lying on the floor, and it looked like I was having an epileptic fit. And my heart rate was quite low, 28 beats per minute, and I got rushed to the emergency in Sydney and found out I had a very low heart rate, and I collapsed. And I wanted to find out a lot more about what was going on in my heart. And at the time I'd studied sport, and I understand a reasonable amount about the heart, but pretty much what the heart does in response to normal exercise and what the heart rate was and how I could train with my heart rate. But I didn't know what was going wrong clinically, so I wanted to know a lot more about that. So after my PhD, I did a master's in clinical cardiology, and that's opened up a lot more opportunities with my research. So we do some work in the hospital with patients that have heart problems, so people that have pacemakers. So you probably know people that have pacemakers, and the pacemaker can do a great job. It can regulate your heart, and probably in this room, one of us is going to have a pacemaker at some point. One of us may have an internal cardiac defibrillator, or someone out of the 800 people. Many of us are going to have heart problems. Some of us are going to have atrial fibrillation, particularly endurance athletes. Lots of issues related to atrial fibrillation, where the top of the heart is going quite fast, and if the bottom of the heart tries to keep up with the top part of the heart, and you're going at 240 beats per minute while you're sitting down there, that's going to make you feel particularly sick, and you're going to be into acidity. You're going to be collapsing because your heart's trying to keep up with the top part of the heart. So we do some work in the hospital looking at atrial fibrillation. We look at what happens when we put a pacemaker in, what happens when, how people can then exercise a lot more after having the pacemaker. And particularly people that have heart failure, where the heart can't pump out enough blood, we need to know if we can train those people. In the past, we put them in a hospital and they lie in a bed and they die at 75, 80 years old. Now we know we can do high-intensity exercise with patients that have got heart failure, patients that have been fitted with a pacemaker. So this is interesting study from a health point of view, but it's also useful from an athletic point of view. So that work has enabled me to understand a lot more about cardiac physiology in patients, but also within my athletes, and we've published some quite good work in that area. And if you look on the screen, you can see the noise around. If you look in the second lead down, you can see that the atria are going really fast. In this case, the ventricles aren't trying to keep up with them, but if they do, then you have a problem. And with atrial fibrillation, it can lead to strokes, and that this can happen in an athletic population as well as an elderly, unfit population. So this is a big issue, and it's a big issue in sport, and it's a big issue in exercise and health. And we can do scans of the heart, not to see the atrial fibrillation, but we can see the structure of the heart and how that may be changing in response to a condition such as atrial fibrillation. So we've had some good findings there. It's also enabled me to look at what we do with a pacemaker. So a pacemaker can fine-tune your heart. So we've done some nice studies where we put people on a fast pacemaker so they can pump their heart quite fast and in control quite nicely. And we've also slowed it down to see how the people respond and to see if they have a much better quality of life because they can do their gardening or they can do their training, or if they feel worse and they feel sick and they keep collapsing because it's too low. So these studies are quite good, and they're very useful for patients and athletes. We do some good work on scanning athletes, and we do that from a research point of view, but also from an aesthetic point of view. It's quite useful looking, and we presented this in an artistic way, trying to look at the scan here of the lungs. But what we're interested in, what really makes up a high-performance athlete. And I know here your research principles, when I was showing around the research this morning, you're very interested in recovery from training, you're very interested in the psychology of an athlete, how you can get the best rest out of the person, how you can optimize performance, and we were interested in this from a overall perspective. And we know with whatever athlete we're looking at, we need to get a lot of these things right. If we get the diet wrong, it can be the diet on the day when we go to the Olympic Games. People can take the wrong bit of food and they've got diarrhea and they can't perform. They take a supplement that they've been told to take that might make them go a bit faster, something like sodium bicarbonate, and they might not be able to tolerate it. Their diet may be poor going into the games and they may not make the weight and they can't perform on the day. They may get their nutrition wrong. So lots of things on the diet are very important. We know about getting the training right and optimizing training. So we do research into optimizing training, getting training right in altitude, getting training right when we're in the heat. So these are a number of things that we're interested in. At the University of Brighton, we have a big centre looking at genetics and also looking at doping from the genetic point of view. So we have a WADA accredited labs within the university where we're looking at, where colleagues are looking at some of these markers, and they have some very good data on some of the top Kenyan athletes, and they're looking at a project looking at the sub-2 hour marathon, trying to see what the genetic makeup is of these individuals that have particularly good performance in endurance sport, and seeing if we can break that 2 hour marathon record, not just with genetics, but also with training principles. So these things are very important, and these are the things we look at in our labs. We look to see how people suffer at the end of their event. Here we've got someone throwing up, pushing themselves to real extremes, and whether that's good or bad for the person, whether they can cope with it and cope with the next training. We need to know what makes up these performers. And we need to know how they recover after those events. So here, one of our athletes collapsing at the end of an event, pushing himself to real extremes. And what we find with people with brain injuries, people with cerebral palsy and brain injuries, they often don't have the circuit in their brain that says, this really, really hurts, I've got to stop doing this. And they can sometimes overcome some of this pain and keep going a little bit longer and not stop, but end up collapsing at the end of the event. And it's something we have to keep a real close eye on. As a coach, we know we can push someone to a limit, but we don't know if that person might be having a stroke, might be collapsing because of their brain, but we need to know the limits of the performer that we're working with. So these are some of the things we do when we're looking at our high-performance athlete. We can make some comparisons. So here's one of our this guy was an Olympic reserve for the triathlon. And here's the guy that runs the scanner, the MRI scanner in the university. And if we make some nice comparisons looking around the trunk, we can see all the density of the muscle here in this individual, and then we see it there in the person that's not particularly fat, but you can just see how much muscle's in one person compared to the elite athlete, and make some nice comparisons, and potentially see how we can train people to improve muscle density. This can be quite expensive, though, sometimes running these scans. We also do this to look at, this is a scan of the legs of one of my Paralympic athletes. So this guy's got brain damage on one side, he can't move his function his legs that well, they don't fire up in the same way. But if you look at the muscle there, the difference between the two legs, there's not a great difference, but the circuitry between the brain and the muscle isn't able to fire up that muscle effectively, so he's deficient on one side. So it's important to look at it from a number of different angles. We okay so far? A little breather. Okay. We also do some work on equipment. So I was asked by a company that had approached me and said, we've got these hot pants. You put these pants on, they're like a wetsuit, really. So they give a good seal, you can't breathe in these pants. And we want to see if they're good for weight loss and see if they're safe to use. And the lady contacted us with a small contract to look at the thermal responses. We see people, their core temperature goes up, the localized temperature goes up. If you look at the difference in the scan there from a thermal imaging camera, you can see the hot spots. You can see, particularly if you could change the material, you could maybe create a greater hot spot. And these seem to work for people losing weight, and they worked obviously because you were sweating a lot more, and people, if they jumped on the scales, thought they were losing a lot more weight. Most of it was sweat, but people became motivated and gradually lost a bit of weight by the placebo effect of wearing these hot pants. The lady that run this company in 6 months made £5 million from a basic pair of hot pants that she said had a particular special infrared technology inside them. We did a little study to try to support her work, but she didn't pay enough money towards getting enough subjects and getting the work to a good level for publication. But she made a lot of money from a very gimmick of looking at hot pants. In performance terms, in the 2012 Olympics, our cyclists put on some hot pants. They put not the same ones as these. They had Velcro attached to them. They sat on the track at the start of the kilometre race or the pursuit race. They had a little battery in the hot pants. It heated their legs up because they were waiting a long time. They've done their warm-up, but we know from our thermal physiology, if we keep that leg warm right up to the start of the race, We've done the neural warm-up. We've produced a little bit of lactate in our warm-up to open up the blood vessels, but keeping it warm while we're waiting around. They put a pair of hot pants on or heated up thermal trousers, ripped off the Velcro, and at the start they were ready to go. It worked very well. The Australians looked across, saying, "What are they doing? What are the British doing?" And they started to panic, and the results came out quite well. So there's a little bit of placebo, but also a little bit of useful physiology in seeing that we can heat the leg up and keep the leg heated up right until the last minute. And these kind of applications are quite useful, little things trying to improve performance. So we do the research, we do a bit of consultancy, we do a bit of work with TV. So here, this guy's approached us and he's made his own human-powered flight. He wants to go on for the longest, to be he's built the plane from carbon fibre. It's 25 meters wide. He's an engineer, and we want to know what sort of power you need to get up in the air, what sort of power you need to sustain to stay up in the air, to keep this thing up. And we did the sums. We looked back at some of the work from previous human-powered flights. We knew that he needed to get about 900, 1,000 watts to take off with the right wind. We knew that he needed about 350 watts to stay up in the air. There's a propeller at the back there you can see rotating. But these things are very, very difficult to fly. So he had the right training, had the right physiology, but mechanically the plane let him down. But we got him off the ground. That was one of the big challenges. We also do some quite good brain work, looking at the neurophysiology. We have researchers doing brain stimulation, and this seems to be a good area where people are stimulating the brain, particularly when the muscle is fatigued and getting an extra twitch beyond what you can produce yourself. I know from some of the work in cycling in other areas, people are using this quite a lot, brain stimulation, to overload the muscle beyond where you can normally push it. And people are finding big changes in performance. But we don't know what the damage that is occurring there. People have got to be very careful in the way that they're administering the brain stimulation. But we also do some stuff looking at video to try to improve the brain and improve the neural side. So here we have an ex-triathlete that's had a stroke, and we're trying to rehabilitate her by getting her to look at a video and getting her to get the cadence, get her legs up to the speed of an elite cyclist, and try to replicate that. And if we can train her brain a little bit to get the speed up, she can get some massive benefits, and it's showing really good promise in her rehabilitation, just increasing the brain by having that video in front of her. Here we've got it in an enclosed area, what we call an igloo, and it's quite good for getting feedback from an angle as well. So if you're in a situation where you're racing, you can put race simulation on here and see how people respond to the video. You can use it for football as well, going up to take a penalty shot and see how you respond to that, putting different stimuli on when we've got this set up here. So it's called an igloo. It's quite a good setup, and you can connect it together and take it apart or leave it set up permanently. So we do stuff looking at the muscle, we do stuff looking at the neural side, but we also do stuff looking at nutrition. What we try to do with our students and with our athletes is to make sure they are good at cooking. We have a cooking laboratory at the university where we can teach people how to make a good risotto, a good Spanish omelette, a good recovery snack, teach them how to make their own protein bars if they want to make those things, teach them about the dietary analysis side of things. With our athletes, we go to their houses to make sure they know how to cook. And speaking to people over the last couple of days, I think this is one area where everyone could improve. We could all be better at our cooking and be better at our hygiene. And we know nutrition has such a big impact on performance and recovery, and it's something we have to get right. We can also use different supplementation, and we know from some of the work that come out on beetroot juice, this is quite an exciting area. We know that it's useful for activating nitric oxide, so we know we can get some vasodilation. So some of the work from colleagues in Exeter, Andy Jones and other colleagues, has shown that it can improve performance. And they said, yeah, it improves performance in endurance exercise. It improves your oxygen kinetics. We can get up to a level a lot quicker. But we wanted to see what would happen with well-trained, just sub-elite triathletes. And we didn't find the differences that they found. We had a good placebo. When they did their work, they had just a Ribena placebo, so it wasn't a decent placebo. But maybe some of their work, they've put up the dosage of beetroot juice, which has enabled maybe the muscle to open up a bit more and capillarization to perform. But also they use sub-elite athletes, people that maybe can't vasodilate that well. And we found with our athletes here, they could not respond to the beetroot juice. So beetroot juice works well in dropping blood pressure at rest. You know, I recommend it to my mother, and it drops her blood pressure by 10, 15 millimeters of mercury. And that's fine. She can go to the doctor and she can avoid taking the pills. But there's lots and lots of different claims about this, but we need to test it out on our athletes. From an elite athlete point of view, it worked with a couple of people. So from a research point of view, you may see no significant difference, but from an elite athlete point of view, if for that person it makes your performance improve by 20 seconds, whether that's placebo or not, it might be worth taking that beetroot juice. So we have to be careful when we interpret research. It's good to look at the outliers and not just the mean, particularly with elite athletes. So we try to test out our products in different ways. So there we did a performance trial. Here we're looking at doing short sprint, medium sprint 30 seconds, and 3-minute sprint here. So we know with our short 6-second sprint, very much high phosphocreatine. We know with our 30-second sprint, still a little bit of aerobic, maybe 20% aerobic, but quite glycolytic demand, quite producing lots of lactate in the muscle and blood. And we know with our 3-minute effort, all-out effort, a 3-minute effort is very, very close, if we look at the average power, very close to our VO2 max. So it's a very high endurance capability. We also know from my research on short 90-second efforts, as well as the research by Van Hatalo in Exeter, that the last 30 seconds of that 3-minute effort, very, very close to critical power. So from all these markers here, we can get the idea of the sprint, short sprint, the high glycolytic demand, the VO2 max, and the critical power, all in one short test. And here we have a 3-minute recovery. We know from 6 seconds phosphocreatine, fast response should occur in 3 minutes. We know after 30 seconds, the lactate's still going to be elevated, but we're going to resynthesize most of the PCR, and then we go into a 3-minute effort. And we use this model, and I use this model in hypoxia, and it's very useful for looking at the changes in hypoxia from the endurance exercise as well as sprint exercise. And I use it with my nutrition work when we look at different products. So we were interested in beta-alanine. I don't know if any of you use beta-alanine as a supplement. So many years ago, creatine was the wonder product of sprint exercise and short sprint exercise. And we have beta-alanine, which is quite useful for buffering. So we get people to take beta-alanine, about 6 grams a day, and we try to look at their performance changes. And what we found is that they can improve their performance, particularly in that last sprint. So it might be useful for buffering. It may be useful if we're trying to do some training where we train people in hypoxia, where we've got that added oxidative stress. We exercise people at 14% oxygen. So that can be really useful for our athletes. So it acts as a very useful buffer. It increases the carnosine content in the muscle and might be worthwhile in repeated sprint activity. It does have some side effects. You get some paresthesis, so you get some tingling in your arms. Some people don't it affects their gut, so it doesn't work for them that well. So we do that. We've done that with sodium bicarbonate, and it can be quite useful. So that's some of the research. I want to now move a little bit towards the application of that research and how that links into the work I do with the Paralympics. And I'm quite lucky to have worked at the Sydney Games, in the build-up for the Athens Games with our athletes. Went to the Beijing Games, went to the London Games, and now building up to the Rio Games. And all of those games have different challenges and different preparation for our athletes building up into those games. And that can be quite stressful for the athletes, can be challenging for me as a coach, and there's always different things that we're trying to do. We're reasonably well funded in the UK. So here's just a few figures from the funding over the cycle here, and I don't know if you know your funding from your own figures, but you can see here, and this is available on the UK Sport website. Athletics gets £26 million for a 4-year cycle. Cycling gets £30 million, and that extra £816 on the end. Paracycling gets £6 million. And swimming gets £20 million. So the model in the UK is based on previous performance and hitting your targets. So if you say in athletics we're going to get 20 gold medals and you get 10 gold medals, then you won't have so much funding in the next cycle. If you say, again, in athletics we're going to get 8 gold medals and you get 8 gold medals, then maybe you get the same funding for the next cycle. So you have to try and set your targets clearly, and you have to try to meet those targets. There's no point of saying you're going to do way better to try to get more money, or there's no point of saying we're only going to get 1 gold medal because that's just too low a target. So in paracycling, when I started with paracycling, we had absolutely no money, and now I don't get paid by paracycling. I do it completely voluntary, and other people get £6 million worth of funding over the four-year cycle. So there's a fair bit of money in UK sport, and it's made a difference. If you look at some of the sports in UK sport, we have a different approach to the French sport, where we target sports where we think we're going to get gold medals, and we target sports that are sitting down sports. So we're very good at rowing, we're very good at cycling, we're very good at sailing. Sports where we can use technology to maybe have an influence on our performance. People still train hard, but if we can do some research into the technology in the sitting down sports on the equipment, then we might be able to perform a bit better. We also target minorities, some of the minority sports, some of the female sports where people perhaps aren't performing that well. We do try to see if there's a chance of gaining a gold medal in an area we may have never worked in before, which might be taekwondo, where we may not have a history for it. And we neglect sports that might be good for the whole country, like handball and other sports where we don't invest much money in. And that's a shame, because those sports can't progress. So things like water polo don't get the funding because we don't do very well, and people get stuck, and if you're a good water polo player, you may not be getting the funding. So we're faced with good funding, but it's important that we can translate the research. So I've talked a little bit about the research, and we have to be able to translate that to the athlete. The athlete might not want to know about muscle buffering and what's happened to beta-carnosine and what happens in hypoxia and what happens when their VO2 max gets higher and what their lactate threshold is. But we need to make sure we put it in the right terminology, and we pitch it right for the coach, and we pitch it right for the athlete. And it's important, and talking to people today, it's important we get that right, so that we can engage the coaches, so that they want to be involved, they want the science, and we can show them that it makes a difference. But we have to show them the numbers, and they want to know, is it going to make 0.5% difference? If I invest 8 weeks in this trial, will it make a 0.2 of a second difference on my 200-meter performance running. And then the person, we have to prove that and show that, yes, if we add all these little things up, it's going to make a big difference. But we need to be good as scientists to engage with the athletes and engage with the coaches. So this is a good challenge, and this is something what I think I'm able to do okay. I can relate to the athlete, whether they're a smart athlete or whether they're an athlete that just wants the real basics and wants to know, how can I go faster? It's important that we don't get things wrong, because if we drop the baton, as we do a lot in our 100 meters running, and we take the risks, we can end up with failure, and we spend 4 years in an Olympic cycle where we don't even finish the race. So we take some risks, but we may at sometimes need to be safe and get the basics right, rather than getting these little things, getting caught up in the little things. It's important that we get around the course. So in coaching, I use this quote yesterday. It's important as a scientist that we work with our coaches well, that we think about the mental side, the physiology side, the tactical side, the lifestyle side, and sometimes the lifestyle side can make the difference. So if we've got a person that's broken up with their girlfriend or boyfriend, or if we've got someone who's got problems with the bank, or if they've got problems in getting funding, or they're struggling with their studies, it's about getting that all together. And I think there's something you do quite nicely here, that you've got the education, you seem to have very good support for your athletes. Your athletes have opportunities to do high-level degrees or to do more vocational degrees, and that's an excellent part that you've got here. But getting the whole lifestyle, the whole idea of being able to cook for yourself, look after yourself, have a career after sport. Some people fail on this, and they focus too much on just all about the performance, all about the 2 or 3 months, not about the whole lifestyle. So it's important we have not just physiologists, we have psychologists, we have social experts, and we have people that are brilliant in nutrition involved, and all those people make up a good team. These are some of the things I find myself doing as a coach, things that I would never say I'm an expert in, things that maybe I shouldn't get involved in certain areas, but you find yourself doing cooking for people, you find yourself looking at performance analysis, looking at the video, how can we go a little bit faster at the start? How can we use our drafting when we're in a cycling position? I find my athletes collapsing, so I use my cardiology when I go to a hospital in Prague when someone's got an ECG out, and I can interpret that and see if the athlete's got a real problem or not. I find myself driving around a course. You've got to go fairly fast, and you've got to be able to get to the front of the peloton if you're in a road race. These are things that you might not think you've got, skills that you haven't got as a coach, but it's important to show that you can offer lots of these skills. So if you go for a job as a coach, don't just say you've got level 3 coaching. You need to have something that stands out a little bit more. And all of these things, writing reports, caring for people, dealing with altitude, having some of these skills are really important. Skills that you get from other areas of your life, not just from the sport, having played the sport. I've got recce on there, that's going out to an event. So going out to Beijing, looking at the course, looking at the hotel, looking at what the nutrition's like, looking about where we can do the training, looking at the safety, looking to see if we've got the right interpreter in place to make sure the athletes are prepared in the best way possible. So various games where we look for, and hopefully you're all looking forward to Rio, and I'll be out there with the Paralympic team. In Beijing, we had pretty good success in Beijing. How did France do in Beijing? Good? Do we do okay in Beijing? London? Too good? How's performance? Drop down for France? Not very good in London. But Rio, you're going to be good? Yeah. So going to the big games is quite exciting, but it's also about preparing people optimally for the big games and making sure that they can perform as good as possible. So One thing for Beijing, for cycling, everything was about getting all the little things right. So here, you can't see it here, but they had special suits made that were really, really tight. They made sure that they had stickers on the back so that the number wasn't flapping around. You know, we still see in athletics people putting safety pins on for the number, and having a number that's flapping, that may be just worth 0.01 of a second per lap. So if we've got that sticker on the back and it's firmly stuck down. The boots, again, no one was able to, they had overshoes, no one could see those boots until the last minute. Straight after the games, they were all shredded, so no one could copy the design of the boots. The bikes there, £500,000 spent in wind tunnels trying to get the best equipment that might enable you to go a bit faster. All sorts of little things about getting it right. So the system works with a performance director. At the time was Dave Brailsford, who's head of Sky now. This guy, Dave Brailsford, when I worked in British Cycling in 2000, he was just a guy that was a bit of a wheeler dealer. He could go and find how we could get a cheap bike bag, or how we could get a decent equipment from China. But he's a very good visionary, and he worked himself up. He became good at getting the deals in for British Cycling. He then became involved in the performance side, and then worked his way up to the top, and then went to the top of Team Sky, and he's been knighted in Great Britain, and he's done very, very well from himself, from someone that just come from a very basic background. But he's done that by pulling together a good team, getting the best biomechanists involved, getting the best nutrition, psychology, sports medicine, and trying to make the best of what they call the marginal gains, the small things. And if you've read Malcolm Gladwell, you'll have similar theory based in that area, just getting every little thing right and how that changes your performance. So the technology here, and this is Jody Cundy, one of our riders here. He's got an excellent carbon leg. It's very, very narrow, not a sort of leg he'd be able to walk on, but it's perfectly designed. It's carbon fibre. It's designed so the air flows around it nicely. You can see his suit there. You can see the helmets that are changed on the day, worked out for particular events. You might need a teardrop helmet. In sprint events, you might need a rounder helmet. So they did all the sums to work out, depending what speed you go, that would depend on what helmet you would wear. And yeah, it certainly makes a difference. The bike frames were bespoke made, made individually for each person. And that technology seems to work quite well. We didn't use this technology, which was in the press, as far as I know, but the idea of having motors and we've seen in the press of the idea that Chris Froome might have a motor. I don't know, but it's very difficult to find out. But this idea of doping with equipment, certainly technology is almost a form of doping with equipment, in that you're getting advantages. If you're a nation that's rich in research and you don't share your research, then maybe you can do a lot better than some of the nations that aren't good at having a wind tunnel, having access to the best carbon fibre, having access to the best equipment. And sport isn't fair, and that's the way it works. This isn't fair at all. This is shocking that this kind of approach is being taken, as well as all the issues with doping. And this is going to be quite hard to detect, because you're going to have to almost saw through a bike to find out if they've got that little motor inside. It's not something you can just easily put through a scanner to see if someone's got that in, or take a blood sample. So our planning for Beijing and our planning for Rio is about getting it right, getting the right efforts in, and here we have a holding camp down in Hyères in France, lovely location that you have in the south of France, really good for relaxing the athletes, but also good for getting a bit of heat work in, and we've used that before Sydney, we used it before Athens, we used it before Beijing, and we used it with a couple of athletes before London. And hopefully we'll use it again for a couple of athletes before we go to Rio. We make sure we overload the athletes with some decent efforts in the build-up to the games, maybe 2 to 3 weeks before. We ease off and we taper a little bit as we go into the games. But we don't completely stop exercising. There's no point for that. We keep the quality there till the last minute. So in Paralympic terms, going into Beijing, which is probably the pinnacle of my coaching career, Sydney, we had 2 silver medals. Athens, this is in Paralympic cycling. Athens, 3 gold medals of the athletes that I coached, and the total gold medals. In Beijing, we tried to get 6 gold medals, and we got 17 gold medals. And I was lucky enough to coach 8 of those gold medals, and 1 of the silver medals, which is pretty good, pretty impressive in terms of hitting the targets. London dropped down a little bit, and the targets for Rio are about 12 gold medals. So we have different issues, and as we go into Rio, we'll have different issues to deal with. We know recently in the press about the Zika virus. That could be a big problem for athletes preparing, and it may mean that people leave it till the last minute to go into Brazil, so we minimise the risk of infection. That might mean we're not that well prepared and not that well acclimatised, so we have to think of different ways of acclimatising before we go in. It might mean we're tired before we go into the games because of travel, so we have to think about these things. In Beijing, we had problems with pollution, so we made sure our athletes were taking some pretty good supplements that were quite useful for their breathing and quite good for their immune system. We made sure they had cooling chairs, so they sat with ice around their arms, and we looked into different methods of cooling, pre-cooling. We made sure they had little fans on their bikes when they're in the track centre, so they could improve their comforts. We put filters in their rooms. We took the mattresses off before they got into the centre and had their own mattresses flown out there. We really careful about infections with the hands and on the feet, so passing things on. People become over the top from that side of things, but it works if you're having less and less infections and respiratory tract infections, then you're going to perform a lot better, particularly in the endurance sports. So we tried to make sure we had a lot of good comforts there to try to make sure we had the best possible performance. The other areas I look at talent identification. So in Great Britain, we have different talent ID things where we look for girls for goal, trying to find girls to come across to different sports where maybe they may be a football player, but potentially they may have the ability to be a brilliant rower. So we try to give opportunities for people to switch sports. And we do a lot of talent camps where we see maybe that person, you've been doing endurance exercise for the whole time, but in fact you're a brilliant sprint cyclist, and maybe we can get you to come across from that. And I know you obviously do some of that here, bringing people across from gymnastics to diving. But these are things we need to have a good idea of the physiology, but also the mental side of things, to see if a person can maybe switch sports to a sport that they've not grown up in. And we don't know, all of us probably could have done better in a completely different sport to what we played in, but maybe our parents took us to the wrong sport, or our coaches made us stay in the sport that we were in. So we have some of those things. We have things with looking at sporting giants, so purely getting people above a certain height with the right levers, the right anthropometry, and seeing if we can get them into the sport. In cycling, we have a lot of talent transfer. So that one of the girls I work with, Sarah Story, came across from swimming. We know from swimming the training intensities and the repetitive nature of swimming. Some people will argue swimmers train too much, but they need to be very efficient in the water. And her ability to tolerate high amounts of training helped her a lot in her endurance work in cycling. Similarly, the guy here has come across from Paralympic swimming, guy with one leg. Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to have done exercise testing and work with these guys. Bradley Wiggins, when he was 18, 19 years old, seeing what his power output was like, I had a pretty good idea he's going to be a good, potentially gold medalist. We knew when he was 17 or 18, the powers that he was hitting were way above what anyone else would do. We had no idea that he'd be a Tour de France champion. And that he'd be knighted and he'd go on to some great success. Chris Hoy, incredibly powerful guy. When I started at British Cycling, quite 75 kilos, not sure whether he was a sprinter, just come across from BMX, but gradually got his training right, got his physiology right, got the right coaches on board, got the right equipment, and become a brilliant gold medalist. And the girl Kelly Holmes at the top, constantly being injured when she came to our labs in 1996, getting the heat chamber, but later on lucky enough to get gold medal 8 years later. And Paula Radcliffe come to our labs quite a lot when she was 18, building up into being a brilliant endurance runner. We had tests on her VO2 max, 78 millilitres per kilogram, which is excellent when she's 18 years old. But also her efficiency was spectacular. Her running economy was incredible. And so lucky enough to work with them. But most of my work's with Paralympic people and people that have had their necks broken in races when they were ex-professionals, or people that have rolled their cars over, or people that have been born with their hand, with their umbilical cord wrapped around their hand, or people born with their umbilical cord wrapped around their neck that's given them brain injury, or people that have had their legs amputated because they've got an infection in their leg and gradually their leg's not responding. And I get more out of working with these people than I do working with the Olympic people, because I think you can make much more of a difference with working with Paralympic sport. Normally they haven't got the same background in terms of the support of equipment, the same background in terms of the physiology and training. So these people we can get big performance changes, and they've also got a good background in terms of their lifestyle before, so they've lived a lot more. So a little bit different to this guy, Chris Hoy, very powerful guy. The athletes that I work for, they're aiming to get world records in their own areas. And if you look at the different areas where my athletes are able to get gold medals, this is on the track, 200 metres, short sprint, 24 seconds, kilometre, 1 minute 9 for a Paralympic athlete, 1:01 for a blind tandem, 3 kilometres, 3:36 for a world record, hour record, athletes getting 44 kilometres in 1 hour around the track, and team sprints. So a big range of physiology, from very, very short to endurance events that are maybe an hour long, and some events that may be stage races now that they're going into more professional sport as non-Paralympic athletes. But most of the work's trying to get new world records, trying to break the world record and breaking down the event to get that world record, and using the knowledge from research to try to improve that, whether that's with ergogenic aids, or whether it's with altitude training, or whether it's with heat training. So these are the people, they get pretty good. She's not just the Paralympic champion, she's the national champion, Sarah Story, for time trial. She was the national champion for pursuit for able-bodied. She's got her own professional team now. She's an incredible athlete. And you could argue in Paralympic sport she's not that limited in that she's only got one hand, but it's quite difficult to ride with one hand, and it's quite difficult to get out of the saddle when you've only got one hand and you're going over some bumps. So she's done well, and she's represented Great Britain in Paralympic and able-bodied sport. She's got 11 Paralympic gold medals, so she's the most decorated athlete in the country. This guy here, David Stone, born with cerebral palsy, 18 years old, power output, maximum minute power 200 watts. Last week when we tested him, 340 watts. So his engine, his aerobic engine, has improved by over 50% through good training, good nutrition, getting his technology correct. He rides on a tricycle. Really hard to ride a trike. If you ever tried to ride a tricycle, you probably have when you were 1 year old. But ride one of these fast. He can beat lots of able-bodied people on a tricycle. It's very technical, changing your weight over. It's very easy to fall off a tricycle. They're not that stable. You've got to be able to go around the corners fast, and you've got to be technically very, very good. So in London, he got a gold medal and a bronze medal. He's going for 2 gold medals in Rio. You can see there he's got some tissue stuck up his nose. We use the athletes inhale some Olbus oils before they go in. He forgot to take his tissue out, but the Olbus oil is very good for opening up the airways before we go into an event. We do some pretty good work in altitude. We get these guys in 14% altitude, 2,800 meters in altitude. We know it works really well if we don't push them too hard. If we keep the lactate around about 3 millimoles, we get some great improvements over six efforts over 10 minutes. Different challenges here for Rachel. She overheats. We have to put her into a hot environment to make sure she can cope when we go to the major games. So here in Beijing, 36 degrees here. When she finishes the race, her legs go into complete spasm. She can't cope with the pain. It feels like soldering irons going into your legs, having barbed wire tied around your legs. But we have to cause that pain before she goes there, which ethically is very tricky because you've got to push someone pretty hard in the heat. But we want her to be the best possible way of coping when she gets to the Paralympic Games. So we have to do that within her mindset and how far we can push her, but also obviously the safety point of view. Yeah, this poor girl, when I met her, she had one leg, she had the other leg amputated, then gradually a bit more, amputated a bit more. She has lots of problems with tendinitis. She has to have an operation on her arm, so she has to train to overcome the pain that she's in. So she does take some morphine, but she goes out and has to train 5 hours a day, because when she's exercising, she feels fine. As soon as she stops, she's in incredible pain. So I learn a lot from working with Rachel. She has very big problems overheating, as you can imagine. In this position here, she hasn't got very much of a cooling effect. She can drink a little bit with a Camelback, but she overheats quite easily. And then this guy here, Darren Kenny, cerebral palsy, brain injury on his neck in the Tour of Ireland when he was a 18-year-old. And he went on to get 4 gold medals in Beijing, 1 silver medal. He beat Xavier Ochoa, ex-Tour de France rider, who again had a brain injury, beat him in the last race there. But preparing someone for multiple gold medals is not easy. And if you see people when they get to Olympic Games and you expect them to get multiple gold medals and they fail, it's maybe because they're not prepared well enough to deal with the success of getting their first gold medal. So they may go off and have a party after their first gold medal, or they may just think, well, I've achieved my goal, I've got 1 gold medal, but I don't know how to get the next gold medal, so they ease off. Here we have to keep them motivated throughout. So the first event was 3-kilometre pursuit, the next event was 1-kilometre sprint, the next event was 250 metres, part of a team sprint, the next event was a time trial, the next event was a road race, all in less than 10 days. So we tried to simulate that in training. We tried to make sure in the first event we didn't give everything away. We did the bare minimum to get a gold medal. We made sure we knew what, if we were last off in the race in the 1 kilometre, we'd still go pretty hard, but as long as we didn't, we knew what pace we had to go to beat the person that had gone off before us. So it's pretty good. He got 4 out of the 5 gold medals, and after this, we know the guy behind him has been implicated in some doping, so he should really have a 5th gold medal here. We look at the power outputs there. The big green trace shows that he's able to hit close to just over 1,200 watts. We can see at the end here, he gets to about 300, 350 watts, and that's an area where we need to work on to try to improve his aerobic side here. So this is a 1 kilometre sprint, taking 1 minute, 9 seconds. But we need to know his physiology and how it works. And we need to know, if we make that back end good, we also need to make sure he can sprint and get in the right gear and get up to the right cadence when he goes into the event. You can see the blue line there, cadence dropping down to about 110 revs per minute. So again, we have to select the right gear, and we have to do some efficiency tests to make sure he can perform effectively. So we put him in different environments. We go out to Australia, we go to Norway, we go in south of France, and we do some good work to make sure they're comfortable, but also that they're challenged in their training. As I mentioned before, it can collapse, and here we have to make sure we checked his brain afterwards just to see, but it's very difficult to simulate some of the challenges you have in the World Championships. It's very difficult to measure localized hypoxia in the brain, and if we can do that, then we might know a lot more about how people can perform to their extreme limits. So some pretty useful studies we do. We also look, I'm just going to flick through fairly quickly on this, just differences between the performance on one leg compared to the other. So we can measure him at 70 revs per minute, 100 revs per minute, 110 revs per minute, and find the optimal cadence, or find the area maybe he needs to work on a bit more to improve his ability because he's weak on one side. Things can go wrong, which was shown before. So it's never all right. So these guys, this is a couple of weeks before the major championships in Beijing. They're going up to about 60 kilometers an hour on the track here. The blind guy on the back, Anthony Capps. And this is 2 weeks before we travel. Or a week before we travel, sorry. 2 weeks before the games. And maybe here the technology hasn't worked. So it's got a puncture, you've got a carbon wheel on the front, and it's completely dissolved, and at the last minute there, the forks are going into the track. That's the only thing that stops him. But think of yourself as the person that's blind on the back, that hears the puncture go and has to have complete faith in your person on the front to make sure you can steer through that. So it's a lot about teamwork. It's a lot about making sure the technology works all the time, making sure the mechanics find out why this has happened. But in the end, the guy broke his scapula, but 2 weeks later was on the start line and getting 2 gold medals. So a little bit of medical intervention in terms of injecting the area that was very, very painful, but also making sure the Australians didn't know that we had a guy that had quite a lot of pain, that potentially they could give a little nudge in the teams in the sprint races. So it's pretty good seeing these guys win and perform well and break gold medals. It's quite nice to be with them. We know they go through a lot of pain. We know they're sick. We know they collapse. We have some pretty good successes, and that's quite good to enjoy that. We do pretty well on the Paralympic medal table, and sometimes get to wear some of these gold medals and take a little bit of credit for some of the work that the athletes do. I've just tried to help them get the best out of them as I possibly can. And normally have a decent party, and hopefully you guys that are graduating tonight might be able to have a bit of a party tonight. But it's about getting it right, being part of a team, making sure you've got a really good relationship with the athletes, and I find I've got a good relationship with the athletes, and sometimes I'm not too bothered about the managers and other people. I'm more worried about the athletes being at the centre and getting the best out of the athletes, rather than worrying about all the admin and managers and people that are interfering and trying to maybe get credit where they don't deserve credit. So Rio next, and hopefully we're going to perform well in Rio. We have a good setup ready, and the athletes certainly that I'm working with are training very, very hard for this, and we'll get it right on the day, and then make sure that they use the research effectively and the coaching support that we can give to get the best out of their performance on the day when they're in Rio. That's it for my talk. Thank you for sticking with me. I appreciate it. It's late this evening, and it's good to see no one falling asleep. So thank you.
The beetroot used in sprinters.
No, so the question was, did I test the beetroot juice in sprinters? And no, we didn't. We tested it in endurance athletes. But I recently examined a PhD, and there's something going on with beetroot juice and sprint performance. And I think, I'm not sure what it is, but in one of the studies from the group in Exeter, I don't think they've looked at it enough in sprinters, and I think there is possibilities for enhancing performance and maybe enhancing recovery. What was your suggestion?
Yes, because when I was first time physician here in 1979,
Yeah.
the French sprinters, cyclists, use nitrate.
Nitrate, yeah.
Yes, as doping.
Okay, yeah.
All the sprinters
Really, yeah.
in cycling use nitrate. Because,
Yeah.
and we told them it is not clever because it's not an endurance exercise.
Yeah,
But many years after, there was a Belgian researcher called Gilbert Maréchal, perhaps you know him. Gilbert Maréchal was the man who found the effect of creatine during recovery.
Yeah.
It's the first one. And Gilbert Maréchal tested the effect of nitrate on isolated muscles.
Okay.
And he found that the nitrate increased maximal power
Wow, yeah.
on isolated muscles.
Yeah.
And perhaps beetroot can improve
Yeah, sprint performance.
the maximal power of cyclists.
Yeah, I think people get obsessed with the idea of the capillarization side of things, and there's something going on in terms of contraction.
But, maximal power during one contraction.
Isolated contraction, yeah. I can't explain why. But I think it's interesting that some of the concepts that we use now, you used 30, 50, 40 years ago, but they come back in different ways and under different beetroot juice in this case, whereas before it's a method of nitrate, of doping almost, yeah. Thank you. Where we go next? Yeah, at the back.
So you were talking about how you were in Beijing and you were analyzing like the environment and just pollution and stuff. And I don't know if you know this, but like, you know, at the lake for like sailing and rowing, like last year during the Junior World Championships, everybody got sick and there's all the fish problems. And, and you know, now it's like getting even worse. How do you like get ready for Rio when you know it's even worse than any past Olympics?
From the water side of things?
Well, not just water. Like it seems like just like everything's going downhill. Like how do you like have you gone over there and had to do some research about that? Like,
I haven't done it from a research point of view. I've
like
gone
the prep,
I've gone to see the setup there, and I know the guys in Great Britain Triathlon have been taking samples all the time in the water to see the contamination there. I guess the thing is to minimise the potential of causing any harm before you go into that event. So it may be that you don't go in, touch the water, and you're probably going to get sick the day after the games, or maybe right at the end. But hopefully on the day, you're not going to take in too much of the pollution. Again, in Beijing, you know, they did quite a lot to switched off a lot of the facilities there, and you would like to think in Rio they'll do things to try to improve the water quality, but I'm not convinced that they will, because there's a lot of corruption in Brazil, and the money has really gone downhill in terms of what they've got available. So I'm not too sure how people are going to cope with that. But I think the idea is just don't put yourself at risk in that 1 week or 2 weeks before, and make sure you check what environment you're going to be training in. In terms of having lots of the right nutrients and antioxidants before you go into the event, but maybe not taking too much of those, because people can take very high dosages that completely mess up their performance. But dealing with the breathing side is important, and there's a few things from a medical point of view as well as from a nutritional point of view, different interventions that we've used that seem to work quite effectively. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I imagine that most research are done with valid athletes, and I would like to know, can you just apply or use your results from with valid participants, or do you need to make specific research on Paralympic athletes?
Okay, yeah, good question. Yeah, so you're saying, can you apply the athlete on non-para athletes? Some of it you can. Certainly, some of the training principles may apply, but you know, what I tend to do with the Paralympic athletes is just see everyone as a case study, and that can be quite difficult to publish all the time. But we look at different interventions as a case study, and that may depend if they've got a brain injury. It may depend on whether we're doing muscle stimulation from someone that may have a spinal cord injury. So sometimes we can apply it, and sometimes we have to make different ways round the research, and maybe it becomes more of a individual case study rather than a full-blown study that we can carry out on 15 athletes. Yeah. And obviously in parasport we have amputations, we have muscle problems, we have blind athletes, we have wheelchair athletes. So there's lots of things we can try to simulate with non-Paralympic athletes. So we can do arm cranking with able-bodied athletes that maybe have got legs, but that's not the same because your blood flow is completely different, the venous return is completely different. So we have to be careful how we interpret some research that's carried out on non-para athletes. Yeah. Yeah.
You've talked about funding before, funding of the Olympic sports. So I just wanted to know if they don't have the temptation to announce less medal to just get the funds and stay over there.
Yeah. I think some sports do. Yeah, when they set out a plan, some sports do maybe go a little bit below and know that maybe they've got this extra card that they know they're probably going to get 5 gold medals rather than 4 gold medals. I think when someone reviews that, they realistically look at the athletes that you've got. So in athletics, for example, funding has gradually got dropped because they haven't hit the targets, but you know, then you can be lucky and maybe one person can get 2 or 3 gold medals. But if that one person that you're relying on is not fit on the day, then potentially your whole funding can go for the next 4 years, or can at least drop down by 50%. Yeah, but people, I'm sure, do have different psychologies in the way that they plan on how many medals they're going to get. But ideally, you want to hit it spot on. You can sometimes, if you get way too many, you might lose the funding, because obviously you've done okay with your £10 million. You're absolutely fine, and you've actually achieved more than you said you're going to achieve. So we'll actually knock you back to 8 million, see if you can still get your golds. Yeah.
In the UK research mindset, do you guys feel like you're on top worldwide? Do you feel like you're the leaders in the sports research world, or do you feel like you're competing with another country or certain other countries?
Yeah. I think we're getting there. I mean, I've been in sports science for 20 odd years now, so I'm relatively new to it, but I've seen all the changes. So, you know, when I started, we were way behind everyone, and we really looked up to Australia for a while, and then we imported lots of Australians, and then we got information out of them. We sent them back to Australia, and we keep a few people there. And research-wise, we're starting to get it right in that we find out what people need, and then we try to find out an intervention to deal with that, rather than just doing research for research's sake. So it has become a lot more performance-focused research rather than before. People would do lots of blood markers, lots of immune markers that maybe wasn't so relevant. And I think with the research funding, you have to justify how you can make a performance benefit for the individual to get the funding.
And like a second part to that is, do you guys have you guys stepped away from being partners with another country? Like, a lot of times we have people going to each other's institutes or you know, put in research departments, but then they don't really. It's kind of like a for show.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of that. There's an element of sharing, but there's also the secret squirrel side of things that no one knows about and only comes out at the last minute. So, you know, certainly in British cycling, there's lots of things that our athletes didn't know until the week before the games. So there's a bunch of people that will be keeping things under wraps that will not share that information. Whether that's good or not, I'm not sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Another question. Do Paralympic athletes have their own federation, or do they belong to non-Paralympic federations?
Yeah.
And do they have their own trainers or coaches or not?
Yeah, good. So in Britain, with the Paralympic funding, it's very good because the athletes get the same funding as an Olympic athlete if they are a gold medalist. So, you know, my athletes will get their £30,000 tax-free allowance because they're the best in Paralympic sport, and the Olympic athletes will get the same. The Olympic athletes will bring in a lot more from sponsorship from private companies outside. In terms of training, the Paralympic athletes are part of the British Paralympic Association. The Olympic athletes are part of the British Olympic Association. But in some sports, they'll share facilities and they'll share equipment and ideas. So in cycling, we do that quite well, and we learn from the Olympic people, and they're based in Manchester. They use the same track, they use the same nutrition people. They don't use the same coaches now. They used to share some coaches. In other sports, they're completely different, and they don't, even swimming, they're quite remotely different to each other because they've got different challenges and different budgets. But sometimes in cycling, we feel that the Olympic people are stealing some money from the Paralympic people and using it to fund their trips, which is a bit of a shame. Yeah.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
I was wondering. We've seen on the slides that the majority of your studies, maybe all of your studies, were regarding British athletes, British sportsmen and sportswomen. In your account, do you know if there's any project for a European, or maybe worldwide, research projects on elite athletes, high sports athletes? I mean, do you know if there are any collaborations which will be done recently, or sooner or later at the European level?
Yeah. There are some good links with different federations in Europe. I know from some of the wheelchair athletes work very well with groups in Germany, Switzerland, and in Great Britain. And sometimes, certainly in Paralympic sport, if you're trying to get a study that gives a good vision across a number of different people, then you need to collaborate because you can only get 2 or 3 subjects, and there are some good work going on between different organisations that's quite useful.
Do you think there will be some financement regarding these kind of researchers sooner or later by the European Union, or maybe?
Yeah, I think there are. If you look at some of the European Union grants, there are opportunities for this. If it can help improve a number of different nations, that it's not just for you and just for your sport. So they're worth looking into. Erasmus maybe funds something like that if you have a good research proposal. Yeah.
Because I was wondering generally if one of the main problems, let's say, that the students like us are facing right now is that we have to, find a job sooner or later.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it would be interesting to know if globally there is some output somewhere to go.
Yeah.
Because I see that in fact you do lots of things on British athletes, and I was just wondering if maybe the possibility for also foreigners like me, like us, to maybe get in these projects.
Yeah, there are
collaborate in these projects.
Yeah, I mean, definitely you're more than welcome to be involved in the work that we do, or get in touch with other people in Britain that may be able to give you some of that experience. I think if you can work with someone and you can get a little bit of funding from different areas, then it may be the way to do your PhD. It may be that you get a little bit of money from the French Federation, you get a bit from the British, a bit from Erasmus, and there are opportunities that they're not so many, and you have to really put yourself out to get those opportunities, and you've got to make the right connections. So one of the things we did with one of our EU grants, we'd worked very closely with the university in Lille, and we had about £1 million worth of funding over 3 or 4 years that enabled people to do PhDs and people to work between Lille and Brighton, and keep a lookout for some of those projects. They will be available, but you might have to keep pestering people that are high up, and people that are getting those grants. Have a look and find out where they are, and if they're in the area that you're interested in, then contact the people. See if you can visit them. See if you can go to their lab. See if you can do a placement. It's hard, but you've got to keep pushing if you want something in academia.
Well, I have a question for you, Gary. You happen to be a scientist and a coach, which is a perfect combination. But what about coaches and research? How do you decide, or how are experimentations decided in UK? Is there a special authority to say, well, this needs to be studied, and how does it work?
Yeah, so in the UK we have UK Sport, but we also have English Institute of Sport, Scotland Institute of Sport, Welsh Institute of Sport. So if you were a coach and you knew something might improve your performance, you would go to UK Sport, but you'd also go to the English Institute of Sport and say, right, I'd like to investigate how I can improve the vision of my football players, and how I can improve the peripheral vision, and how I can get a sports psychologist involved. And you would ask if you can get some funding to do that. If the sport can improve and can show that they can get some medals, then they might have the money given to them. Or it might be something that might be useful in one sport but might be able to transfer over to another sport. Sometimes it's the coaches asking, sometimes it's a scientist saying, look, why don't you try this brain stimulation? Why don't you try this nutritional intervention? Why don't you try altitude and a combination of different things? So I think sometimes it's difficult to get the coaches engaged in that. So sometimes you have to go to the coach and tell them what you can offer. So you put a menu up and say, this is what I can offer, something small that might help you before the event, a main course that might help you on the day, or a dessert which might help you with recovery, and you offer some of those things that might be useful to the coach. And the coach might say, well, my athletes are really struggling with recovery. What's the latest? What can I get my athletes to take? Is it ketones? Is it something else that might improve performance? Yeah. Should I take one last one, or carry on?
Last question, I guess. Sorry. So it's obvious that you've had like a lot of good results, and this is more on a personal basis, where you know how like athletes are always like worried, oh, am I going to medal, or am I going to come up to the standards I abide to, like medal wise or like ranking wise? And as a sports scientist, do you feel that pressure too? Like you're like, well, if something does happen that is negative, am I gonna lose my job? Am I gonna you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
do you feel that same kind of pressure even though you're on the other side of the?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think I probably have as much nerves as the athlete on the day, because if you get the preparation right, or if you get something wrong, you know, so say we know sodium bicarbonate might be useful for sprint performance, and someone takes it, and before the event they're on the toilet, and then something is going to go disastrously wrong because you've got the dosage slightly wrong, then you can worry about it because you're responsible for it. Ultimately, the person's had to take a supplement, and they decide whether it works or not. So you do feel concerned. I guess I'm in a position where I work with these athletes part-time, so I do this voluntary with these athletes, but your reputation can change. So if everything goes wrong, if I prepare an athlete and say I'm going to get 5 gold medals and they get absolutely nothing, and they become 8th in every race, then it's my reputation that I'm concerned about. But ultimately, you kind of prepare someone as best you can, and that person, you then make them take the responsibility on the day. So you should have done everything right, and then on the day they'll perform well. And if you've got the right numbers, you can roughly know that if you go to the betting shop, you know if they're going to win or not. Yeah.
Hi, Gary.
Hi.
You talk about UK sport. You talk about the English Sports Institute. And can you give us a bit more information in regards with Sport England and the British Olympic Association?
Yeah, okay. So we have UK Sport, which does a lot of research, gives the funding out to the different sports. That comes from the government, and that's based on the gold medal performances. So the government has a certain amount of money, and they say where that's going to go. UK Sport then distribute that. UK Sport are constantly going to the sports and saying, where are you? Are you on target? Are you off target? The English Institute of Sport will work with athletes that are from England, but they're still ready for the Olympics, not just for the Commonwealth Games. Sport England now is more about health and exercise, and using sport as an example to improve the health of the nation. So they have a fair bit of money, but that's more for projects that are involved with physical activity and physical inactivity. The British Olympic Association has less of a role now. It used to be the big organisation, but now UK Sport are responsible for performance, and they're responsible to the government for getting more funding. It's improved massively, and most of this money is from lottery money in our country. Thank you. Thank you once again for sticking with me. Thank you for some brilliant questions and coming along this evening, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.